Ask people on the street when the American Revolution started, and many will say July 4th, 1776. But actually it began much earlier than that. The roots of that war extend back more than a decade earlier to another war, the French and Indian War. It's confusing to a lot of people. Who was fighting who? Well, it's often disregarded for its role in setting the stage for the American Revolution, what many people refer to as our first Civil War. But the French and Indian War basically was a 9-year conflict that ended in 1763, matching the French and their Native Americans against the British colonies and their Native Americans. 2 years after the war started here, Great Britain declared war on France, beginning what in the European area is known as the 7 Years' War. Most of the fighting took place from Newfoundland on the north to Virginia on the south. It ended with a British victory and France ceding its territories east of the Mississippi and giving its western territories, called Louisiana, to Spain, which had been its ally. That cession made up for Spain's loss of Florida to the British. It also settled who controlled the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. But early in the war, something important happened that laid the groundwork for the events beginning 20 years later that we are talking about tonight and are part of our celebration. An important precedent was set in an effort to develop better relations with the Indian tribes and the British to defend British territory from French attacks. 7 colonies sent delegates to Albany, New York, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. The more southern colonies of New Jersey, Virginia, Georgia, North and South Carolina, along with Newfoundland and Nova Scotia to the north, did not send delegates to this meeting that was held in the summer of 1754. There was no talk at that time of forming a new nation, but it was the first time that some colonists had met together to establish a process that led to increasing cooperation as the colonies were drawn closer together in coming years. The delegates spent most of their time debating a plan of union, suggested by Pennsylvania delegate Benjamin Franklin. A union of 11 colonies with a president appointed by the king. Each colonial assembly would pick delegates to a grand council that would have legislative authority over colonial and Indian affairs. The plan portrayed the colonists as loyal British subjects, respectful of Parliament, but being in a new world requiring different forms of government. They began the document by saying, "It is proposed that humble application be made for an act of Parliament of Great Britain, by virtue of which one general government may be formed in America, including all the said colonies, within and under which government each colony may retain its present constitution, except in the particulars wherein a change may be directed by said act. And it promised that the laws made by them for the purposes aforesaid shall not be repugnant, but as near as may be agreeable to the laws of England, and shall be transmitted to the king in council for approbation as soon as may be after their passing, and if not disapproved within 3 years after presentation, remain in force." Franklin created the famous Join or Die cartoon that was just referred to earlier, showing a snake chopped into sections to promote the Albany Plan of Union. It would bring the colonies into a confederation under British leadership. But when the plan was taken to the colonies rejected it. They weren't interested. They wanted to protect their own independence. And the British Colonial Office also rejected it because it didn't want to give up control of the military here. Franklin speculated many years later that the world would have been much different if the local officials had adopted the Albany Plan. He wrote, "It now seems probable that if the foregoing plan, or something like it, had been adopted and carried into execution, the subsequent separation of the colonies from the mother country might not so soon have happened, nor the mischief suffered on both sides have occurred, perhaps during another century. For the colonies, if so united, would have really been, as they then thought themselves, sufficient to their own defense, and being trusted with it as by the plan, An army from Britain for that purpose would have been unnecessary. Franklin was sent to England in 1757 to represent the Assembly of Pennsylvania, but it was his international fame as a scientist that achieved the greatest notoriety over there and earned him entrance to the high people in government at that time to carry forth the message from Pennsylvania. Biographer Charles Goodman says his political role was to persuade the sons of William Penn, still residents of Britain, to provide permanent funding for the Pennsylvania Assembly instead of just occasional grants, discretionary grants. Their refusal to do so convinced him that the only solution was for the colony to become independent of these proprietors and put under control of the British king. Now, King George III was not happy with the treaty that ended the war in 1763. He thought that it favored the losers, France and Spain, more than his country, even though the conclusion of the war did make Great Britain the dominant national power in North America. The charters of some of the early British colonies extended the westward boundaries of those colonies all the way to the Mississippi River, and areas that had been settled by the French, but generally were considered the home of several Indian tribes. But nonetheless, the colonies claimed land all the way out here. George III ended those boundaries with a royal proclamation that limited colonial expansion by assigning the territory west of the Alleghenies to Quebec and to the Newfoundland colony. It protected for the time being the interests of the tribes west of the Alleghenies, but it did allow for orderly and lawful extension of colonial lands into the area. It allowed colonists to cross into the area, but they couldn't settle there. Private purchase of Native American land was banned. It was reserved, any acquisitions of those lands was reserved to the royally arranged colonies. The British government already had approved some sizable land grants in the area. The colonists and land speculators had plans for settlement in those areas. But in fact, there were already some settlements in the area. Some of the colonies paid no attention to the King's line, and they settled their conflicts with the tribes until the line was adjusted 5 years later in a series of treaties with Native Americans opening large parts of the present state of Kentucky and what became West Virginia to settlement by colonists. It was the end of the wars here and in Europe that laid the foundation for our march toward independence, because Great Britain was left with a debt almost twice as large as its debt before the war. The end of the war here and in Europe left them trying to find a way to pay that debt. As the war was ending, the British government decided it would keep 10,000 troops in the colonies to protect the colonists from the Indians. Leaders of the movement did not expect colonists to pay off the debt, but they did expect them to help offset the cost of troops. Parliament enacted the Sugar Act in early 1764 as a fundraising tax, and later that year the Currency Act that prohibited the colonies from printing paper money was passed. The colonial economy had gone into a slump after the war, and resentment started to build in reaction to these taxes. The Sugar Act listed goods that could only be sent to Britain, the most notable being lumber. Anybody caught violating that act and sending lumber somewhere else would be tried in a British court, not a colonial court, and the colonial court, of course, was more likely to sympathize with the people here. Many of them were smugglers. Colonials began to protest not because of the issue of taxation without representation, but because the economic losses in New England ports were growing, because we could only export stuff to Britain, not elsewhere. Now, why did they emphasize lumber? Because the masts of British ships required tall pine trees, and Britain had pretty much denuded its forests over the years, but this was new country here. We had a lot of tall pine trees, and they wanted to reserve our pine trees to put masts on their ships. The Sugar Act prompted Massachusetts Firebrand Samuel Adams to start a campaign against what he saw as an infringement on colonial rights. He argued Parliament could not tax colonists because the colonists had no representative serving in Parliament. He claimed the only people who could levy taxes on the colonists were members of colonial assemblies. He went public with his views at a Boston town meeting where representatives were chosen for the Massachusetts House. He was picked to write the instructions based on the sentiments of those at that meeting. And it was in these instructions that Adams railed against taxation without representation for the first time. For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands, he asked. Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? This we apprehend annihilates our charter right of government, and to tax ourselves. It strikes at our British privileges, which as we have never forfeited them, we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to a miserable state of tributary slaves? The Boston town meeting approved his instructions, an action making it the first American political body to argue that Parliament could not constitutionally levy a tax here. It was also something even more important, because it was the first official recommendation that the colonies should unite in defense of their rights. These instructions were circulated throughout the colonies in pamphlets